Alright, hello, my name is Jacob, and I will be starting off the presentation for Chapter 9 of Operations Anti-Patterns DevOps Solutions. Uh, this is Chapter 9, Wasting a Perfectly Good Incident. Basically all about incident response and so on and so forth. And basically, the chapter starts off by explaining what exactly an incident is. So, it explains it to be that an incident is something unexpected or unplanned that creates an adverse effect. Now, most companies like Google, Amazon, so on and so forth, they they leave the word incident for something big, like a massive data leak or something like that. When really an incident can be something small too. Uh, it can be used to explain most things when something that you didn't plan for or something you didn't want to happens when you finish some task. And then it also goes into what exactly a postmortem is. So there's different terms for what the book calls a postmortem. It can be incident reports, retrospectives, after action reports, stuff like that. But the author tends to like the word postmortem more and explains it as the process to assess the events leading up to the incident. It's usually some sort of meeting with relevant stakeholders and participants, and it's basically just to find out what exactly went wrong and how that can be fixed. Now, the postmortems themselves. The main thing to know for with a postmortem is just to stop playing the blame game. Stop pointing fingers. Stop trying to figure out who did the thing wrong and to like punish them for that. That's not cohesive. It's not going to end up with a good postmortem. It's not going to end up solving the problem. It's just going to postpone it to the next person who makes the same mistake. Usually, you'll want to look for failure in the systems themselves instead of in people. Now, sometimes the people do just make a dumb mistake, but most of the time, the failure is going to be in the systems such as training or how people are like supposed to be doing stuff, how the system actually works, stuff like that. And this blameless culture isn't going to happen overnight. You know, it's probably going to start with someone, probably you, me, one of us, the people who are reading this actual book and actually have these thoughts in our heads to actually want to fix the system. Now, there's different like examples and whatnot of what looking for a failure in a system instead of a person looks like. And one of those is say there's a new hire or an intern that doesn't get trained exactly right, and then they make some dumb mistake, and instead of actually blaming that person and making sure they get fired or punished or however, you need to actually fix the training that they receive to make sure that they don't make those mistakes. Because if you just punish the new hire or the intern, it's just gonna whenever there's another new hire, they're just gonna make the same mistake again. Mental models. Mental models are what a person creates when they're part of a certain system. Now, it can vary wildly as to what the mental model is of. It can be something like going to the DMV versus understanding what their deployment system looks like. Now, it's usually reasonable to assume that people are going to have gaps in their mental model. They're not always going to have it spot on or correct. They will not always realize the nitty gritty details unless they're like genuine pros in those systems. And it's important to acknowledge this discrepancy between what the person's mental model looks like and what is actually happening, what the real model is. Say, because maybe an engineer has this mental model of what their system looks like, and it's mostly correct. Like, they know that their user makes a request, which goes to a web server, reads data from a database, and it fetches session data from a caching server. But what they don't realize is when that user makes a request, it goes through a load balancer, which goes to one of several web servers on this web server cluster. Uh, the info they get from a caching server to fetch their session to realize the request that goes to a proxy server, which then goes to one of multiple database servers who require the proxy for database shards. Now, the engineer, they don't need to know all of that, but they're not going to realize it, and then that's where the main mistakes are going to be happening. The 24 rule. Basically, the 24 rule is if there's an incident, have the postmortem within 24 hours. If it's not within 24 hours, then that waiting is going to let those memories fade. There's going to be nuance that gets lost. It's not going to be quite as effective as doing it very quickly after the incident. Um, Essentially, the waiting, doing it within the 24 hours also reinforces the learning. It makes it's like when you get into a car accident. The very recently after the accident, you're gonna have that sense of adrenaline. You're gonna be super attentive whenever you're driving right after. You're making sure that that mistake doesn't happen again. But then the bad habits come back. You're back to, I don't know, checking your phone at a stoplight or, you know, checking to change the song while you're driving, stuff like that. And then doing this within the 24 hours not only reinforces that learning, reinforces knowing what went wrong and how to fix it, it ensures that the post-mortem document gets created, which will be able to be spread throughout the company so that the learning doesn't stay just within the group of people who are associated or made the mistake. It can get spread out to other people who will then be able to read it and be like, oh, okay, I will make sure not to do that so that this incident doesn't occur again. Now, to set the rule for any postmortem, you really need to set rules for it because it can quickly devolve into pointing fingers and stuff like that. So these certain guidelines need to be in place for the postmortem to proceed effectively for people to actually figure out what went wrong and how to fix that. Now, the guidelines should be spent or should help keep the conversation to actually fixing, repairing the systems. People will quickly go to playing the blame game and pointing fingers, but that's not conducive to the postmortem. And we need to really try our best to stay away from that. And that is the beginning of chapter 9. Next up is Jose.
Thank you, Jacob. Now, before we continue, we have a little thing that the book gave us that we'll have called a example incident. Now, what happened here is a incident that happened at 1:29 a.m. and it involved we'll call him Sean, our engineer. Essentially, the trigger was that there was a background work queue that was exceeding its thresholds, right? Now, initially, the on-call engineer, he had received this at 1:29 a.m. and it was just like a little warning or a little alert, and he didn't really pay much attention to it. He didn't pay much mind to it, so he felt fine to just kind of snooze it and then just push it off. Well, 30 minutes end up passing, and he ends up getting a bigger alert again, and it's now become a massive issue. Now he has to go through and he figures, okay, how am I going to solve this? So he works out through his little steps inside of his head, resets two of those work queues, but it doesn't end up working out. And in the end, he decides, okay, I need to escalate this. The problem is that when he goes to look to where he has information to see who to contact next, there's really no other phone numbers. There's really just a list of email addresses. And now he has essentially would be stuck here either A, trying to have to contact every single one of those email addresses, or what he ends up doing is escalating further to his direct manager. From there, his direct manager was able to contact the principal engineer, and that is where he was able to figure out that the consumer daemon, was not running. Problem is that Sean doesn't really didn't know what this was. Only the principal engineer knew about it, and as such, by the time it was finally found out and discovered, it took about 45 minutes for it to properly finish. So, in the end, that was the incident. So, now that we have our incident, let's go ahead and now address the postmortem attendance. When we are bringing people into our little postmortem meeting to discuss what had happened here, the very first thing that we should obviously invite would be the engineers themselves. Obviously, we would want to have the engineers themselves added because they are the ones who have the first hands-on experience. Next after that to consider would be any project managers. The reason why we want to add in the project managers is so that way they can get an understanding of what does this incident cause to the organization, what is going to impact timelines, how's it going to impact how we're going to organize resources. It's a lot of stuff they'll need to be able to manage. Next one option after that would be the business stakeholders. Now, in this sense, they're not going to be as technical minded, so inviting them does a few things. Mainly, it kind of gives us sort of real world, more of, I guess you could call it a layman's look into things and say, okay, how is this incident going to affect our bottom line? How is this going to affect us? And then finally, and I will say the book does especially stress that this is kind of an optional little area. What if we have to add in invite human resources to kind of see the post-mortem? Now, the reason why this is such an optional is because if there was an event, if this was an incident where it was due to a lack of people, well, human resources would be able to be like, okay, so they need more people to throw in, and that's how they can potentially contribute for future things. Now that we have our attendance, we have our incident, we now have who's there. Now let's go ahead and move on to the timeline. Setting up the postmortem timeline is by far probably the most important step in this process. Because through this, we have to look through this from an objective lens where we go through what happened, such as in this case, the alert was triggered on a queue overload, who did the steps to kind of mitigate things, in this case, like Sean the engineer, and then we also had the principal engineer contacted, his direct manager. When did it happen? This is always good, so that way we can always just see, like, for future logging. And then, of course, as we're going through all of this, we want to stick with the facts, right? Less of like saying that the service was restarted incorrectly, because it would be like, well, incorrectly how? Incorrectly to what standards? As we kind of saw in this incident, our engineer Sean didn't really know the standards, or didn't really know like what are the things that was happening in here, right? He didn't know about the consumer daemon. Others who would have known, oh, we had to reset that. So that's where the sort of like issues of trying to judgmental language or saying things comes in, because realistically that type of talk just leads to name blaming, and it kind of doesn't really break down and just doesn't give the good sort of like feelings in this sort of meeting. This is supposed to be a 100% factual meeting to try to go through everything, right? Now, when we talk about those facts, of course, this is where we bring in what we say is the context, right? Factual context of what happened and also really why it happened. So, when you're in the postmortem section of things, the questions that would be asked would be why were decisions made, right? So that way, once we get that out of the way, we can understand what was the sort of mental model behind those actions, right? So in this case, in the Sean example, we can see it as, okay, so I know that these queues are overloaded and backed up. So therefore, with what Sean would know, he would know, okay, to reset the system. And then he knows if that doesn't work, he would escalate, right? This would be an example of going through this mental model, understanding the process, so we know where did the system went wrong. In this case, Sean was not properly informed of all of the little systems inside this queue system, but we can also see where he went right. In this case, contacting up to his manager, and this so it's the manager is able to contact to the proper principal engineer to help fix things, which of course is what we have here in the example because the engineer knew about the proper naming conventions of the logs, right? And there's a little note here. The book used the terms tribal knowledge to kind of explain this because only this principal engineer knew what that was. That would be an example of tribal knowledge. And tribal knowledge is just one of the main anti-patterns that we generally want to avoid in a DevOps environment because, well, as we can continue, we go into, in this case situation, what would be the sort of improvements that we would therefore find in this example, in this postmortem process. Like, for example, what were the system gaps? In this example, we found that, for one, the alerts were not clear enough to convey risk. We found that the on-call directory lacked critical contact information. And then in this example, we saw that there was the issue of those tribal knowledge, sort of knowledge silos is another example of it, of how critical information was just not properly shared. Which is fine, because in this sort of post-mortem, stuff like this is where it would be discovered, and this is where it would be ironed out, right? So, as we continue on, how will this be handled? Well, going back up again, obviously we would know in a case like this, alerts would be made better clearly, as well as potentially having the business impact stated. We could have incidences of on-call documentation and escalation paths would have been better fixed in this example, right? And then, of course, the big one is that sort of eliminating the knowledge silos, eliminating the sort of tribal information by having all of this information in the systems be better documented and given out to the individual workers and the individual engineers, right? We can go ahead and train, and then through this process, of course, it means training our operations teams with the sort of mental models to be able to go through this process easier, right? And then, of course, obviously, in the DevOps ways, we can think about trying to automating service restarts and checking for health in these cases. And of course, again, sharing the knowledge to prevent silos. So obviously, this whole little example was all very tailored to this specific incident, but the main takeaways here, what we find is the whole postmortem process is all about sharing of information and how do we continue on and respond from this, right? This is where we can find the gaps and then where we can then improve upon things, right? Um, Now, as we continue along with the presentation, I will go ahead and pass it along to my next partner, Adrian. And yeah, there we go.
Defining action items. Postmortems must result in actionable items. Actionable items consist of short to long term tasks that are specific in accomplishing a goal, are time bound, specify who completes the work that's required, and are categorized as either short or long term action items. Short term action items are typically high priority tasks that have pretty strict and short dates and deadlines themselves, typically maybe even a day to a few days at maximum for the deadline. They're also typically short themselves to actually complete, but are necessary steps for the company. The long-term tasks contain of many steps before actual completion. They might have multiple subtasks to complete before the main task is actually completed. They typically have longer deadlines, and they also can contain important tasks, but may not be an immediate priority to the company, hence why they have a longer deadline. Following up with action items. Action items are typically used with a ticket management system. These tickets are for sending status updates on tasks and document the actionable items themselves. They typically include deadlines, who or which department will be completing the tickets, any agile-based information for project managers such as priority levels, story points, sprints, etc. And have detailed descriptions of the tasks to be completed. Following up with action items. Action items are also in ticket management systems, as it gives us any assignee the ability to send updates on a task in a centralized place. Action items should not go past their respective due date, and any action items that are nearing any deadlines should receive follow-ups either from the ticket management system itself or any project leads or assigners who are assigned tickets. Any action items in initial review can also turn into an accepted risk instead of an actionable item, but this is depending on review and acceptance of the company. Documenting postmortems. Documentation of postmortems typically include the overall events that occurred and an executive summary. This may include a high-level description of the incident that occurred itself, any issues that may have led to beforehand to cause the issue, and a quick summary of the decision-making process and any actionable items that were created as a result. It would include the incident details itself, the process for resolution, the issues, and any action items that were created as a result. Postmortems should span all company audiences from both the technical to non-technical perspective, and are often used in conjunction with templates for overall consistency within the company itself. Incident walkthrough reporting details. The first section of any postmortem should include date and time of the incident that started, the date and time the incident was actually resolved, and the total duration of the incident, any systems or customers that were impacted. And this is information that is typically important to gather as it provides metrics for the company on the issue itself and the mean time to resolution for any issues itself for the company to also report back to any customers or stakeholders within the company. Incident walkthrough reporting details part 2. The incident summary should be a formal and structured writing of the incident with high-level details of the incident itself, meant more for higher ups of the company for them to understand any alternative stakeholders in the company, such as potentially HR or any PR teams. A summary should be under 3 paragraphs in length and explain all affected resources and damages sustained, as well as the generalized plans and action items for resolution. The most important part of the postmortem is the walkthrough itself. This is typically meant for any technical employees involved, such as developers or engineers, and typically include a detailed timeline of the incident, going from before the incident occurred, the status of the servers or whatever was affected at that point, the incident itself, and the resolution after the incident. It also typically contains the original walkthrough of the decision-making process itself for the action items that were chosen, and any charts data, or alerts representing the issues seen within the annotations. The annotations are crucial for helping to quickly understand any of the issues or why they may have occurred, as well as an explanation of the overall issues with the engineering team and to get a better understanding of all the issues that were represented. Resources such as any wiki articles or links to manuals are also included in this incident walkthrough reporting process, as it contains important information as to why any actions were chosen for a resolution. Cognitive and process issues. This section highlights issues that the group has identified in the postmortem call as areas for improvement. This is typically meant for just double checking that all processes were followed correctly, checking that no steps were missed in the process, ensuring all processes consider any particular or unique incidents and failures, and identifying any areas that contributed to the failure itself. Action items. Finally, in a postmortem, the last items are the action items. These should overall be a list of tickets generated from the postmortem meeting, including who completes what task, the task itself in a fair level of detail, when tasks are due. Sharing postmortems. Typically posted in major areas where all users can see. They are typically contain labels for efficient search, and typically organized within format and naming convention. In the chapter, we were given the example of a date and a short description of the incident itself that occurred. In this case, we have January 1st, 2019, description of excessive database locking during deployment. Documents should be made available to everyone as a learning moment on how postmortems function and are created, and are typically hosted in wiki sites within the company, such as Confluence or Atlassian, as well as any message boards and emails sent to the company regarding any issues that may have occurred. Summary. In this chapter, we learn how blameful postmortems are ineffective. We understand the in-depth perspective of the engineers to understand the decision-making process in the resolution of issues, how to define action items, how to document postmortems, and how to share postmortems effectively. Now we get into the review questions. Review question 1. Why is it important to include roles such as project managers, business stakeholders, and occasionally HR in an incident response postmortem? Incorporating diverse stakeholders into postmortem meetings goes beyond the technical deep dive. It helps contextualize the incident in a broader operational and business terms. Question 2. Why is it ineffective to focus on punishing individuals for incidents instead of examining systemic issues, and what example is used to illustrate this point? The answer we pull from the chapter 9.1, page 193. The reason the blame game doesn't work is that it attacks the people as a problem. Through your system will continue to produce employees who are in a position to make the same mistake over again. Review question 3. How does structuring a postmortem facilitate understanding and incident response effectively amongst all stakeholders? A structured postmortem increases readability amongst all stakeholders in a non-technical format by detailing executive summaries which assist all parties in quickly finding relevant information about the incident and any immediate tasks. And here are resources. The first link is a video from Professor Messer on incident response. The second article is an article posted by Atlassian for the DevOps incident management process. And the final article is one from Datadog HQ on the incident postmortem process best practices to continue. Right. Thank you, everyone. Any questions?